It's the 14th day of the 12th month, 1703. Snow falls on Edo like a shroud, muffling the sounds of a city that doesn't yet know it's witnessing history. Through the pre-dawn darkness, 46 men march in perfect formation. They carry no banners, wear no armour, just simple black robes over white burial kimonos. At the head of the column, an old man carries a wooden bucket. Inside, wrapped in white silk, is the head of their enemy. This isn't a victory parade. This isn't a tale of glorious revenge. It's about 47 men who made a vow that could only be paid in blood. First their enemies, then their own. If these dark tales resonate with you, consider subscribing and let us know where you're listening from. I'm curious who else understands that some vows echo longer than the lives that make them. Now take a slow, deep breath. Settle into your coziest spot. Let the modern world fade away as we journey to Edo-period Japan, not to that snowy death march, but to a spring morning 2 years earlier, when cherry blossoms still promised beauty instead of blood. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom on the morning everything went wrong. It was April 21st, 1701, and the corridors of Edo Castle hummed with the quiet efficiency of absolute power. This was the Matsuno Oroka, the great pine corridor, its walls adorned with painted pine trees that seemed to watch the endless parade of officials, servants, and samurai who kept the shogun's government running. The proud lord of Akko domain, Asano Naganori, stood in that corridor trying to master ceremonies he didn't understand. At 34, he was a provincial daimyo thrust into the Byzantine world of court protocol, as out of place as a soldier at a tea ceremony. The silk of his formal kamishimo whispered with each movement, the fabric still stiff and new, smelling of the camphor it had been stored in. Beside him, Lord Kira Yoshinaka moved with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent 60 years navigating these treacherous social waters. The High Master of Court Ceremony was teaching Asano the intricate rituals required for receiving the Emperor's envoys. Or rather, he was supposed to be teaching. Instead, what emerged from Kira's thin lips were corrections delivered with the patient condescension reserved for slow children. His voice carried that particular tone of helpful cruelty, each word honeyed with false concern while dripping contempt. When Asano bowed, Kira noted how provincial lords always had such charmingly rustic interpretations of proper angle. When Asano spoke the formal greetings, Kira wondered aloud if perhaps the accent of Akko made certain words sound so unusual. The air between them grew thick with unspoken insult. Other officials pretended not to notice, their eyes carefully averted as they hurried past. Everyone knew the game being played. In the coded language of the court, Kira's treatment sent a clear message. The country lord had failed to provide appropriate gifts for his instruction. Not bribes, of course. Never bribes. Simply the customary tokens of appreciation that kept the machinery of government properly oiled. This was how the court worked. Officials on modest stipends supplemented their income through these considerations. It wasn't corruption. It was tradition. Everyone understood. Everyone participated. Everyone except Asano Naganori. The culmination came with a single word, delivered with surgical precision in front of passing courtiers. Kira, adjusting Asano's sleeve with exaggerated care, murmured something about country bumpkins and their quaint misunderstandings of civilized behavior. The exact words would be debated by historians, but their effect was immediate and catastrophic. Something inside Asano snapped with an almost audible crack. Time dilated in that moment, the way it does when disaster strikes. The Lord of Akko reached for his sword, not the long katana, which would have been left at the castle entrance, but the shorter wakizashi at his side. The blade sang as it cleared its scabbard, the sound cutting through the corridor's murmur like a scream. But rage makes poor swordsman of us all. The attack was passion without precision, fury without form, Asano's first strike caught Kira across the forehead, opening a gash that would scar but not kill. The second swing sliced into the older man's shoulder as he tried to turn away. Blood marked the painted pines, shockingly red against their eternal green. It should have been a killing blow. Would have been, if Asano had been thinking clearly. But this wasn't the practiced draw of a warrior. This was the flailing of a humiliated man whose honour had been ground into dust by someone he couldn't touch through proper channels. Guards materialised from nowhere, the way they do when power is threatened. They wrestled Asano to the ground before he could strike a third time. His sword clattered across the polished floor, coming to rest against the base of a painted pine tree. A broken sword for a broken man. Kira knelt in the corridor, one hand pressed to his bleeding forehead, his ceremonial robes ruined, but he was alive, wounded, humiliated, but breathing. In the arithmetic of what followed, that single fact would cost 47 lives. The judgment came before the sun set, in a garden pavilion within the castle grounds. Asano Naganori knelt on white tatami mats. He'd been allowed to change into a white kimono, the colour of death, of endings, of snow that covers all sins. Before him, a small lacquered table held a tanto, its blade no longer than a man's hand. The crime was absolute. To draw a sword within the shogun's castle was forbidden. To attack a high official was unforgivable. To do both was to sign your own death warrant in blood. There would be no investigation into provocations, no consideration of circumstances. The law was the law. As tradition demanded, Lord Asano was ordered to perform seppuku, the ritual end prescribed for samurai who'd committed grave offences. By sunset, in a garden pavilion within the castle grounds, he knelt on white tatami mats in his white kimono. He composed his death poem. More than cherry blossoms, inviting a wind to take them away, I wonder what to do with the rest of spring. The ceremony proceeded according to ancient tradition. When it was complete, Lord Asano Naganori of Akko was no more. The news reached Akko as the cherry blossoms began to fall. The chief retainer, Oishi Kuranosuke, stood in the castle's main hall as he delivered the news to the assembled warriors. At 42, Oishi had the solid build of a man who'd spent his life balancing ledgers and managing domains rather than wielding swords. His face, normally animated with the easy confidence of authority, had aged a decade in a day. The samurai received the news in stunned silence. These weren't just soldiers losing employment. This was an entire world collapsing. Their identity, their purpose, their place in the rigid hierarchy of Tokugawa Japan. All of it ended with their lord's death. Some wept openly, others sat in rigid stillness, processing the impossible. A few younger men muttered about revenge, about honour, about justice. Oishi silenced them with a look. The castle was certainly full of the shogun's spies, waiting to see if Asano's men would compound their master's crime with rebellion. The official ceremonies of dissolution proceeded with mechanical precision. The castle was surrendered peacefully. The Asano family treasures were catalogued and removed. One by one, the samurai collected their final stipends and dispersed like smoke in the wind. But not all of them scattered to the four winds. On a moonless night, 3 weeks after their lord's death, 47 men gathered in secret at a merchant's warehouse on the outskirts of Edo. They came in ones and twos, moving through the shadows with the practiced stealth of those who understood that being seen together meant death. The warehouse smelled of rice and dried fish, the everyday sense of commerce that seemed to mock their samurai pretensions. They knelt in a circle, these lordless men, ranging from Oishi's own 16-year-old son Chikara to grizzled veterans in their 60s. By lamplight, their faces were masks of grim determination. Oishi spoke first, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. Their lord was dead, their domain was gone. According to law and custom, they should disperse, find new masters, begin new lives. But there was another law, an older law. The law that said no man should live under the same heaven as his lord's killer. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. To pursue Kira would be to become criminals. The shogun had rendered judgment. The matter was closed. Any action they took would be rebellion against the state itself. One by one, they spoke their minds, not grand speeches, but simple declarations. A young samurai named Horibe talked about the shame of living while their lord's humiliation went unanswered. An older warrior spoke of duty that transcended law. Oishi's own son, barely a man, spoke with quiet intensity about honour being worth more than life. When all had spoken, Oishi produced a document, not a plan for revenge. That would be too dangerous if discovered. Simply a pledge of loyalty to their dead lord's memory. A promise to restore his honour, whatever the cost. They signed it in blood. As they prepared to leave, returning to the shadows that would hide them, they shared sake from a single cup. It was good sake, probably looted from the castle stores, and it tasted of better days. They drank and told stories of their lord. Not the man who died in disgrace, but the leader they'd served with pride. For a moment, in that warehouse that stank of commerce, they were samurai again. Brothers bound by something stronger than law or logic. They laughed at old jokes, remembered shared campaigns, spoke of victories that seemed like dreams now. The youngest among them, a boy of 17, couldn't quite hide the tremor in his hands as he drank. Oishi noticed and placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. The boy looked up, fear and determination warring in his eyes. "Are you afraid?" Oishi asked quietly. "Yes," the boy admitted. "Good," Oishi replied. "Only fools feel no fear when choosing death. But you chose anyway. That makes you braver than any man who chooses from confidence." They dispersed before dawn, melting back into a world that no longer had a place for them. 47 men bound by a vow that could only end one way. They'd signed their names in blood, but the real price would be paid in the currency of patience, humiliation, and finally, violence. The cherry blossoms had fallen, the season of blood had begun. Outside, the first light of dawn painted Edo in shades of grey and gold. Somewhere in the city, Lord Kira slept soundly, the cuts on his face already beginning to heal. He had no idea that 47 ghosts had just been born, and that they would spend the next 2 years learning how to haunt him. The transformation began with a bottle of sake, and ended with a man destroying himself one calculated disgrace at a time. Oishi Kuranosuke arrived in Kyoto as summer tightened its humid grip on the old capital. He'd chosen his stage carefully, not Edo, where every move would be scrutinized by the shogun's agents, not some remote province where he could disappear quietly. Kyoto, specifically the Gion district, where pleasure and commerce mingled in the shadows of ancient temples. Gion was perfect for a man planning to lose himself. The district came alive as darkness fell, a different world emerging with the setting sun. Paper lanterns bloomed like night flowers along the narrow streets, their warm glow casting dancing shadows on the wooden facades of tea houses and brothels. The air was thick with competing perfumes, incense from the nearby Yasaka shrine mixing with the sweet smoke of tobacco pipes and the underlying scent of grilled fish from street vendors. Through these twisting alleys, the sound of the shamisen drifted like a ghost, that 3-stringed instrument, its notes falling like drops of sound into pools of silence, provided the soundtrack for Oishi's performance. The clickety-clack of wooden getter sandals on stone created a percussion beneath the melody, while somewhere behind paper screens, women laughed in that practiced way that could mean anything or nothing. This was the ukiyo, the floating world, a place dedicated to ephemeral pleasures, where samurai could shed their rigid codes for a night and merchants could pretend to nobility, where identities were as fluid as the sake that flowed from ceramic bottles into waiting cups. Oishi had arrived with money, not much by the standards of his former position, but enough to begin his performance. He took rooms above a modest establishment on Hanami-Koji Street, where the proprietress asked no questions as long as the silver kept flowing. The script he'd written for himself was simple: become everything a samurai should never be. The first week, he was merely a heavy drinker. The second, a habitual drunk. By the first month's end, locals knew to expect him stumbling through the streets at all hours, his hakama askew, his hair escaping from its topknot. He frequented the lowest establishments, the ones where even the sake was watered and the women's smiles never reached their eyes. But drinking alone wasn't enough. A samurai drowning his sorrows might still be dangerous. Oishi needed to be broken, not just bent. So he began to frequent the gambling dens hidden in Gion's back alleys. He lost consistently, spectacularly, with a kind of desperate enthusiasm that marked a man trying to throw away more than money. When he won, which happened just often enough to keep him coming back, he spent his winnings immediately on more sake, more gambling, more visible dissolution. Word spread, as word always does in small worlds. The former chief retainer of Akko was destroying himself in Kyoto. Some whispered he'd gone mad from shame. Others said he was drinking himself to death, unable to live with his failure to die beside his lord. Kira's spies reported every detail. They watched him vomit in gutters. They noted his trembling hands at the gambling tables. They described his pathetic attempts to paw at courtesans who regarded him with barely concealed disgust. Their reports painted a picture of a man who'd not only accepted his disgrace but embraced it. Perfect. But the public performance was only half the torture. The private cost cut deeper. On a night when autumn rain drummed against tile roofs, Oishi sat in his rented room and penned the hardest letter of his life. His brush moved steadily across the paper, each character a small betrayal. He was divorcing his wife of 20 years. The official reason was his shameful behaviour. No proper woman should be bound to such a disgrace of a man. She should be free to return to her family to perhaps find a better match. Their younger children would go with her, innocent of their father's shame. He sealed the letter with hands that didn't shake from sake. The next morning, he made the journey to his family's temporary lodgings on the outskirts of Kyoto. His wife received him in a small room that smelled of the cedar chest where she'd stored what few possessions they'd saved from Akko. She read the letter in silence, her face a porcelain mask that revealed nothing. When she finished, she set the paper aside with careful precision. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not surprise but understanding. She knew. Of course she knew. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read the truths he couldn't speak. She accepted the divorce with a grace that nearly broke his resolve. No tears, no recriminations. She simply asked about provisions for the children. He'd arranged everything: a modest stipend, a house in her brother's village, school fees for their sons, everything except a father. The children were brought in to say goodbye. The younger ones didn't understand, clinging to his hakama with sticky fingers, asking when he'd visit. His daughter, old enough to comprehend disgrace, wouldn't meet his eyes. His eldest son, Chikara, stood apart. At 16, he was old enough to choose his own path. As the others were led away, Chikara remained. "I'm staying," the boy said. Not a question, a declaration. Oishi studied his son's face, seeing echoes of the baby he'd once held, the child who'd trained with wooden swords in the castle courtyard. He saw determination there, and underneath it, the fear that comes with understanding consequences. "You know what that means," Oishi said quietly. "I know. There's no shame in living, in finding a new path. There's no honour in it either. Not for me." Oishi wanted to argue, to command, to save at least this one piece of his family from the fate he'd chosen. But Chikara was samurai-born, samurai-raised. The choice was his to make. That night, Oishi returned to Gion and drank himself into oblivion. This time, the tears that streaked his face weren't part of any performance. The seasons turned, and Oishi's degradation deepened. He perfected the art of public humiliation. He would pass out in the street, kimono soiled and stinking. He brawled with other drunks over imagined slights. He begged for drinks when his money ran low, abandoning even the pretense of samurai dignity. The culmination came on a winter day when frost painted Kyoto's temples white. Oishi lay in the gutter outside a particularly notorious establishment, too drunk to move. Passers-by stepped around him with expressions ranging from disgust to pity. Just another broken samurai, they thought. Another casualty of changing times. A group of samurai from Satsuma province, far to the south, were passing through Kyoto. Their domain was known for maintaining the old ways, for holding to Bushido with an almost fanatical devotion. When they saw Oishi, whom one recognized as the former chief retainer of Akko, their reaction was instant and visceral. The leader of the group, a man with the straight-backed bearing of one who'd never known defeat or shame, stopped in his tracks, his face contorted with rage as he took in the spectacle. Here was a man who should have died with his lord, or at least avenged him. Instead, he wallowed in filth and dishonor. The Satsuma samurai's words came like hammer blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. He spoke of duty abandoned, of honor sold for sake, of ancestors who must weep to see their descendants so debased. Other samurai would have responded to such words with violence. Even a merchant would have shown some spark of anger. Oishi merely blinked up at him with unfocused eyes. The physical assault that followed was almost anticlimactic. The Satsuma man's foot connected with Oishi's face, a calculated insult, as touching a samurai's face was a grave dishonor. The kick was followed by the ultimate degradation. The man spat on him. The glob of saliva landed on Oishi's cheek and slid slowly down into his dishevelled beard. The street had gone quiet, everyone watching to see how this confrontation would end. Would the drunk find some last vestige of samurai spirit? Would he rise and demand satisfaction? Oishi wiped his face with a trembling hand and mumbled something that might have been an apology. Then he rolled over and appeared to fall asleep. The Satsuma samurai stood for a long moment, perhaps hoping for some reaction that would justify further violence. Finding none, he turned on his heel and stalked away, followed by his retainers. His final words carried clearly in the winter air. Something about putting down a dog that had gone rabid. The crowd dispersed. The show over. Just another drunk samurai learning his place in the new order. But one observer didn't leave immediately. A nondescript man in merchant's clothes lingered, memorizing every detail. Later, he would write a report that would find its way to Lord Kira's hands. The report would describe, in meticulous detail, how thoroughly broken Asano's chief retainer had become. Kira read that report by candlelight in his Edo mansion, unconsciously touching the scar on his forehead. For the first time in almost 2 years, he smiled. If Oishi Kuranosuke had fallen this far, surely there was no threat from Akko's former samurai. Surely he could finally relax his guard. In Kyoto, Oishi cleaned the spit and blood from his face in the privacy of his room. He allowed himself one small smile, an expression as cold as winter frost. The hardest part was over. Kira believed. The mask was complete. But masks, no matter how well crafted, extract a price from those who wear them. And Oishi had been wearing his for so long that sometimes, in the dark hours before dawn, he wondered if there was anything left beneath it. While Oishi performed his one-man tragedy in Kyoto's pleasure quarter, 46 shadows dispersed across Japan like seeds on the wind. Each carried the same burden, to disappear completely while preparing for a single moment of violence. They shed their samurai identities like snakes shedding skin. emerging as new creatures entirely, merchants, monks, craftsmen, anything but what they truly were. For men raised from birth to stand at the apex of the social order, this transformation was a daily humiliation that cut deeper than any blade. Consider the particular torture of a samurai becoming a merchant. In the rigid hierarchy of Tokugawa Japan, merchants occupied the lowest rung, deemed parasites who profited from others' labour without creating anything of value. These warriors, who had been taught that touching money was beneath their dignity, now had to haggle over prices and bow to customers. They who had worn 2 swords as symbols of their right to kill now carried abacus beads and ledger books. One of them, a former captain named Okano Kinnaman, established himself as a rice merchant in Osaka. Each morning, he would dress in the plain kimono of commerce, its rough hemp a constant irritation against skin accustomed to silk. He learned to bow properly, not the proud inclination of a samurai acknowledging an equal, but the deep, servile bow of a merchant seeking favour. The worst moments came when he encountered real samurai. They would swagger into his shop, demanding credit, treating him with a casual contempt reserved for his adopted class. He would bow and smile and extend the credit, knowing they might never pay, knowing that to demand payment too forcefully would invite violence he was no longer permitted to answer. But the humiliation served a purpose beyond mere disguise. Every slight, every insult, every moment of forced civility was fuel for the fire they were carefully banking. When the time came, that fire would burn hot enough to consume everything in its path. In Edo, the conspiracy took on its most dangerous dimension. Several of the Ronin had infiltrated positions that brought them into direct contact with their target's household. They became day labourers, gardeners, carpenters, invisible people who could observe without being observed. One among them, Kanzaki Yogoro, managed the most delicate operation of all. Posing as a tradesman, he began frequenting the same tea houses as the builders who had worked on renovations to Kira's mansion. Slowly, carefully, he gathered information, the location of guard posts, the layout of interior rooms, which windows were barred and which were merely shuttered. The popular legend would later claim that one of the Ronin married the daughter of Kira's architect to steal the mansion's blueprints. The truth was less romantic but more impressive. Through patient months of casual conversation, purchased drinks, and carefully guided discussions, they assembled a mental map of their target's defences as detailed as any architectural drawing. But the most crucial intelligence came from observing Kira himself. The Lord had been cautious in the months following the attack, surrounding himself with bodyguards, varying his routines. But as Oishi's performance in Kyoto became ever more convincing, Kira's vigilance waned. The spies noted everything. Kira had resumed his regular tea ceremony schedule. His guards had been reduced from 20 to a mere handful. He attended public functions again, no longer fearing every shadow. Most tellingly, he had begun renovations to host a New Year's celebration, a sign that he felt secure enough to plan for the future. Meanwhile, the physical preparations proceeded with agonizing slowness. Weapons had to be acquired without arousing suspicion. In an era when the shogunate strictly controlled arms, especially in Edo, every sword and spear represented a terrible risk. They used the shadow networks of commerce they had come to know so well. Weapons were hidden in shipments of pottery, dismantled and concealed in bolts of cloth. Some were purchased from black market dealers who asked no questions as long as the gold was good. Others were carefully recovered from hiding places where they'd been cached before the Akko domain's dissolution. Each piece of equipment was a puzzle to be solved. How do you transport armour through checkpoint guards, piece by piece, hidden in false-bottom merchant crates? How do you move 24 men into position without being noticed? In ones and twos over weeks, each taking different routes, staying in different inns. The most challenging acquisition was also the most necessary. Winter clothing that would allow them to move silently through snow. They needed garments that wouldn't rustle, boots that wouldn't creak, dark fabric that would blend with shadows. These items were gathered slowly, carefully, each purchase made in a different district by a different man. Among all these preparations, one story stands out for its particular cruelty. Though whether it represents the cruelty of the conspirators or the code they served remains a matter of perspective. Okano Kinnaman, the rice merchant, had taken a wife to complete his disguise. She was the daughter of a local merchant family, grateful for a match with what seemed to be an established trader. For 2 years, she'd been a dutiful wife, managing his household, bearing the small humiliations that came with their merchant status. She knew nothing of his true identity or purpose. As winter deepened and the time for action approached, Okano faced a terrible choice. His wife was innocent of any involvement in the conspiracy, but when the Ronin completed their mission and faced the inevitable consequences, she would be left widowed, dishonoured, possibly questioned by authorities. He could have divorced her, as Oishi had done. Instead, he chose what he saw as mercy. He simply disappeared one winter morning, leaving behind enough money to see her through several months and a letter suggesting he had fled from business debts. She would be abandoned but not actively dishonoured. She could claim ignorance, remarry, continue her life. Whether she saw it as mercy when she woke to find herself abandoned is not recorded in any history. As autumn turned to winter, the threads of the conspiracy began to draw together. Messages were passed through seemingly innocent channels. A merchant's letter discussing rice prices contained coded information about guard movements. A monk seeking alms carried verbal messages between scattered cells. The final gathering was set for the coldest part of winter, when snow would muffle sound and the New Year's preparations would provide cover for increased activity in the city. One by one, the scattered Ronin began to converge on Edo. They came as they had lived for 2 years, invisibly. A merchant closing his shop for the holidays, a monk on pilgrimage, labourers seeking winter employment, 46 men sliding through the shadows of a city that had forgotten they existed. In his Kyoto rooms, Oishi received the final message. It came hidden in a shipment of sake, appropriate for a man who'd spent 2 years pickling himself in rice wine. The message was simple. The moon is full. Time to remove the mask. He settled his debts with the establishment. A drunk might be forgiven many things, but not leaving bills unpaid. He packed his few possessions, including items that had been hidden beneath floorboards for 2 years. His hands were steady now, no tremor of the drunkard in them. As he prepared to leave Kyoto, he caught sight of himself in a polished bronze mirror. The face that looked back was gaunt, marked by 2 years of calculated debauchery. But the eyes were clear and cold as winter stars. He wondered if his wife would recognize him now, if his children would know their father beneath the mask he'd worn so long. But that was a question for philosophers and poets. He was neither. He was a weapon that had been carefully maintained while appearing to rust. The merchant who operated the establishment saw him leave, noting that he walked straighter than she'd ever seen. Later, when news came of what happened in Edo, she would remember that transformation, how a broken drunk became something else entirely in the space of a single morning. But she would keep that memory to herself. In the floating world, one learned not to ask questions about the masks people wore, or the faces they revealed when they finally took them off. 46 shadows were converging on Edo. Lord Kira, secure in his mansion, prepared for his New Year celebration. He had no idea that ghosts could be patient, that shame could be performed, that honour could hide behind the mask of dishonour for exactly as long as necessary. The 14th night of the 12th month arrived dressed in a blizzard's white robes. Snow had been falling on Edo for hours, transforming the city into something from a dream. It muffled the usual nighttime sounds. No clatter of gita on stone, no calls from late-night noodle vendors, no drunken singing from the pleasure quarters. The city slept under its frozen blanket, unaware that 46 ghosts were moving through its streets. They assembled in small groups at predetermined locations, each man arriving at precisely the appointed time. 2 years of planning crystallized into these moments. Every route had been walked, every timing calculated, every contingency considered. They wore dark clothes over white death robes, their faces blackened with charcoal. Some carried ladders, others coils of rope. Each bore weapons that had been hidden, hoarded, cherished through 2 years of shameful patience. These weren't the matched daisho of proper samurai, but a mongrel collection. Some ancestral blades saved from Akko, others purchased from shadowy dealers, a few simple but effective implements fashioned by their own hands. At the final gathering point, a merchant's warehouse that smelled of pickled vegetables. Oishi addressed them one last time. His voice was different now, not the slurred mumble of a drunk or the measured tones of a chief retainer, but something harder and colder. He didn't speak of glory or honour. Those words had been worn smooth by 2 years of friction against reality. Instead, he spoke of completion. They had made a promise. Tonight they would keep it. What came after was as fixed as the stars. His son Chikara stood among them, 17 years old now, having chosen this death over a life his father had tried to offer him. The boy's face was calm, resolved. He'd grown into his choice over 2 years of preparation. Oishi felt pride and grief in equal measure, but showed neither. They divided into 2 groups as planned. 23 would assault the front gate under Oishi's command. The other 23, led by his son, would take the rear. Simple, direct. No elaborate stratagems beyond the 2 years of deception that had brought them to this moment. Before they moved out, they performed one last ritual. They had prepared letters explaining their actions, each man carrying an identical copy. The letters were addressed to the authorities, to the public, to history itself. They wanted no misunderstanding. This was not robbery or random violence. This was the settling of a debt. They moved through the snowy streets like wolves, silent and purposeful. The few people still abroad at this hour saw nothing, or if they did, they had the wisdom to see nothing. The city guard, such as it was, remained in their warm posts. Who would be mad enough to cause trouble on a night like this? At Kira's mansion in Honjo, the guards huddled around braziers, passing sake to ward off the cold. They were professionals, but not elite. Why would they need to be? Lord Kira had been safe for 2 years. The threat, if there ever really was one, had drunk itself to death in Kyoto. The first they knew of danger was when the front gate exploded inward. The Ronin struck with coordinated precision. The front assault drew attention and defenders while the rear group scaled the walls and struck from behind. It was brutal, efficient work. The drowsy guards, caught between 2 forces, fell quickly. Those who tried to fight died. Those who fled were allowed to run. The Ronin had no quarrel with hired swords. Inside the mansion, chaos erupted. Servants screamed. Women fled to inner chambers. Men scrambled for weapons they'd never thought to need. Through it all, the Ronin moved with terrible purpose, checking each room methodically. Kira's bedchamber was empty, but Oishi placed his hand on the bedding. Still warm. Their quarry was close. The search took on a desperate quality. The mansion was large, full of hiding places. Time was their enemy now. Soon the alarm would spread. The city would wake. The authorities would come. Then, a discovery. In the courtyard, half hidden by snow, a small structure used for storing charcoal. Fresh footprints led to its door, already being covered by falling snow. They surrounded it carefully, weapons ready. Inside, they found him. Lord Kira Yoshinaka, the mighty master of ceremonies, cowered among charcoal sacks. He wore only his night robes, his feet bare, a short sword clutched in trembling hands. In the lamplight, the scar on his forehead was clearly visible, Asano's mark, the blow that started everything. Oishi knelt in the doorway, his voice formal and respectful despite everything. He identified himself and his purpose. They were the retainers of Asano Takumi no Kami, come to complete their lord's intention. He offered Kira the honour of dying by his own hand, presenting the same dagger their lord had used for his seppuku. Kira stared at the blade but made no move to take it. His mouth worked soundlessly. Whether trying to form words or prayers, none could say. The moments stretched, marked by the soft hiss of snow falling through the doorway. Finally, Oishi nodded to his men. They held Kira down, not roughly, but firmly. There was no hatred in it, no personal animosity. This was duty, as mechanical as drawing water or lighting a fire. Oishi studied his son, the blade he'd carried hidden for 2 years, and completed the grim task with a single, precise stroke. They wrapped their enemy's remains carefully in white cloth. This wasn't trophy-taking, but ritual necessity. Their lord's spirit required proof that his honour had been restored. Before leaving, they performed one last service. During the assault, several fires had started. The Ronin extinguished them all. They had no wish to see innocents burn for their actions. They even left money to cover the damage they'd caused. A strange courtesy in the midst of revenge. Then they formed up and marched out into the snow. The journey to Sengaku-ji temple took them through the waking city. Dawn was breaking grey through the blizzard. Early risers saw them pass. 46 men and one more marching in perfect formation, several carrying a covered burden. Word spread like fire despite the cold. By the time they reached the temple, crowds lined the streets. Some called them heroes, others saw murderers. The Ronin heard neither praise nor condemnation. They had ears only for the bell that would announce their arrival at their master's grave. At the temple, they performed the final rituals. The remains were ceremonially prepared at the temple's well. They carried them to Asano's grave and placed them before the stone, along with the dagger that had started and ended everything. They burned incense. They read their statement aloud, formally reporting the completion of their mission. Then they sat in the snow and waited. The authorities arrived at midday, not the rough handling they might have expected, but a formal delegation. The Ronin were placed under arrest, but it was closer to protective custody. They were divided among 4 daimyo for safekeeping while the government decided their fate. The debate raged for over a month. They had broken the law, defied the shogun's justice, committed murder, but they had also embodied the higher samurai virtues. To execute them as criminals would be to deny the very principles the shogunate claimed to uphold. To free them would be to admit that personal honour superseded state law. The judgment, when it came, was masterful in its cruel precision. The Ronin would die, the law demanded it, but they would die as samurai, by their own hands. They had earned that much. On the 4th day of the 2nd month, in 4 separate locations, 46 men in white robes knelt on white mats. The youngest was 17, the oldest past 60. Each composed a death poem and performed the final samurai ceremony of seppuku, according to ancient tradition. They were buried together at Sengaku-ji, their graves becoming an immediate pilgrimage site. People came to burn incense, to pray, to argue about what their deaths meant. But meanings were for the living. The dead had paid their debt in full. The shogun who ordered their deaths understood something the crowds did not. In granting them honourable death, he wasn't rewarding them, he was containing them. Their example was too dangerous to let live, but too powerful to simply crush. So he wrapped their rebellion in ritual, buried their defiance in honour, transformed their victory into the system's ultimate triumph. They had kept their vow. The system had kept its power. Everyone got exactly what they'd paid for, and the price was always blood. In the years that followed, their story would be told and retold, twisted into shapes they wouldn't recognise. Heroes, villains, exemplars, warnings. They became whatever the teller needed them to be. But on that snowy night when they completed their final ritual with the careful precision of men fulfilling a sacred duty, they were none of those things. They were just 46 men completing a task they'd started 2 years before, knowing that the only reward for keeping your word was keeping it. And in the end, perhaps that was enough.